St. Drogo's parish had long been the sort of place one passed without noticing. Nestled between leafless trees and the crumbling brick of Norfolk's oldest stone roads, it sat like a forgotten wound in the land, wrapped in black ivy and soot from centuries of coal smoke. Its bell tower, long silenced by rust and disuse, pointed upward like a broken finger toward a god no one seemed to hear anymore. The stained glass windows, darkened and warped by time, bore saints whose faces had melted into nothing recognizable. It had become the church where boys were sent, when no other would take them, those too distracted, too odd, too silent, or too ungovernable. In January of 1919, the parish was near abandoned, with barely a dozen congregants attending on a Sunday. Yet by the second week of February, something inexplicable happened. 44 altar boys, all between the ages of 7 and 14, were delivered one after another to St. Drogo's. None of them had ever served at a mass before. None of them knew one another. They came from distant towns, orphanages, boarding houses, or were handed over by mothers with faces as pale as bedsheets and eyes that refused to meet those of Father Anselm, the gaunt priest who stood at the church gate as though he had been waiting his entire life for their arrival. And perhaps in some other world or darker corner of time, he had. His appearance unsettled even the hardiest of Norfolk's people. Standing over 6 feet tall, thin as a candle's last inch, his skin had the color and texture of old vellum. His eyes were deep-set and strangely lightless, and when he spoke, his voice rasped as though pulled from behind a veil. Yet he greeted each boy with certainty, never asking their name, but instead naming them, always in Latin. Marcellus, he'd whisper, placing a bone-white hand on a child's shoulder. Aurelius. Valentinus. The boys did not. Mrs. Calloway, who lived nearest to the parish, awoke one night to find her walls vibrating. Not just with sound, she said, but with words. Her dog howled until blood poured from its ears. Another villager swore she dreamt of one of the altar boys standing at the foot of her bed, chanting in a voice that sounded like a dozen throats speaking as one. When she awoke, she found muddy footprints in her hallway, too small to belong to any adult, but too deliberate to be those of a sleepwalking child. Then came the fog dot. It began as a morning mist, thicker than usual, clinging to the ground until noon, but within a week it had become something else. It did not lift, it did not drift. It pressed against windows, wormed through chimneys, and settled into the lungs like smoke from a long dead fire. Lamps flickered and dimmed within it. Horses refused to step forward when facing the church. The sun became a rumor, and still, the altar boys sang. Always at dawn, always for 13 minutes, always in that unknowable tongue. The rhythm never varied, the pitch never cracked. No one saw them leave the altar or rest their voices. No one even knew if they slept. By April, many believed they no longer did Father Anselm, once merely eerie, now appeared cadaverous. His robes hung from his shoulders like sheets from a skeleton. He spoke less, and when he did, his words seemed to echo, though no one could say from where. When questioned about the boys, he would say only, "They are not new, they are returned." Attempts to remove them were made. The parish council sent constables to question the priest and inspect the church. The constables never made it to the pulpit. One collapsed just past the vestibule, clutching his head as blood trickled from his ears. Another began muttering in what sounded like Aramaic before being dragged out, eyes rolled back into his skull. Even those who only stow. The fog that descended upon Norfolk in the waning days of March was not born of weather or sea, but of something older, something patient and deliberate, as if summoned by the boys themselves, or perhaps something speaking through them. It did not arrive as a rolling mist or a creeping haze, but appeared all at once, draping the village in a colorless shroud that turned day into dusk and night into something formless and still. Visibility dropped to mere inches, even in the open countryside. Lanterns glowed dimly like dying embers, and the lamps that once lined the narrow cobbled streets sputtered and failed, as though suffocated by the very air they sought to pierce. There was no wind, no chill, only a stillness that settled deep into the bones. Within this breathless hush, nature recoiled. Crows crashed dead from the sky with no marks on their bodies, as if something had broken them mid-flight from the inside. Cattle refused to graze. Hens stopped laying. The fields, once green with barley and flax, wilted into brittle gray, and not even the stubborn moss clung to the sides of wells. And through it all, the parish of St. Drogo's stood unmoved, its decaying stone facade seeming to loom taller beneath the fog, the grotesque carvings of forgotten saints along its arches warping subtly with each passing night, as though they too were listening to the chants that now echoed from the church every midnight without fail. 13 minutes of perfect, unbroken song in a language not meant to be spoken aloud. The town's people, already fearful, now grew paranoid, for they claimed the boys were no longer simply chanting. They were watching. Some insisted they could see faint glows behind the stained glass windows, not candlelight, but the cool phosphorescent shimmer of eyes, not reflections, but the eyes themselves. Children began to whisper about the boys moving differently now, more precisely, as if they were being directed. One terrified boy said the altar children turned their heads in unison toward passing villagers, even though the villagers were outside and the glass was too dark to see through. "They can see in ways we can't," said the child's grandmother with a shudder. "They see through things now, through us." And inside the nave, the air had changed. Those who dared open the doors, even for a second, reported the church no longer smelled of incense and old wood, but of scorched stone and salt, as if something ancient had been exhumed beneath the foundations. Word reached the diocese in East Anglia, who promptly dispatched a team of 3 scholars to observe the events: a linguist from Cambridge, a professor of theology from Oxford, and most notably, a retired Vatican archivist named Father Matteo Gervasi, a man rumored to have worked in the most restricted levels of the Vatican's secret archives, where forbidden histories were locked away not for their falsity, but for their danger. The 3 men entered the parish on April 3rd and never issued an official report. The theologian returned pale and silent, took a vow of monastic silence, and joined an abbey in Wales. The linguist was committed to an asylum within a week, muttering to himself in a voice not his own, repeating the phrase, "They do not speak, they recall. They do not speak, they recall." Father Gervasi, who had braved exorcisms in Congo, unearthed catacombs in Prague, and translated cursed scripture in J, took off his shoes and lay in the street, never speaking again. It became increasingly clear that these were no longer boys, at least not in any human sense. They did not eat. They did not blink. They did not age. Their voices were not voices, but conduits, open channels for languages that were never meant to return. Dead tongues now found living flesh, and the boys became instruments, vessels that spoke not with memory, but with perfect alien recollection. Ancient words rolled from their mouths with effortless harmony. Ritual invocations, burial chants, mathematical incantations from vanished civilizations. Their nightly chant became precise, always at midnight, always for 13 minutes, always followed by silence so deep it seemed to pull at the soul like a tide. Speculation turned into panic. The local physician vanished after spending 1 hour with the boys. His home was later found abandoned, windows blackened with soot from the inside. Notes discovered in his desk described it hearing not just one voice per boy, but multiple, some soft and mournful, others harsh and commanding, layered in time, rising and falling like waves of memory crashing on the shore of the present. He wrote, "They are speaking death itself into motion." As April bled on, Norfolk became a town of whispers and closed doors. Candles burned constantly. Babies were born mute. Elders died babbling in scripts never documented. One gravekeeper swore the earth beneath the cemetery had begun to tremble, subtly at night, as if something buried was shifting, not upward, but outward. Rumors swelled that these weren't boys at all, but vessels, temples of bone and breath carrying the will of civilizations long turned to dust, each syllable a lock turning, a seal cracking. The chanting was no longer seen as communication. It was a liturgy, a sequence, a countdown, though to what, no one dared to guess aloud. A few brave souls began fleeing the village. Most simply locked their doors and waited, whispering rosaries to gods that no longer seemed to answer. By the end of April, the Diocese of East Anglia, in desperation, sent a final letter to the Vatican. It was delivered by hand. The reply came in a black envelope, sealed with crimson wax and stamped not with the papal seal, but with a symbol that even the oldest bishop could not decipher. A spiral surrounded by 13 arrows, all pointing inward. Inside a single phrase written in Latin, obliti non redibunt. The forgotten must not return. But they already had, and still the boys chanted. May 7th, 1919 began like no other morning that spring. If it could even be called spring anymore, for the land had stopped following seasons since the chanting began. But that morning something shifted in the stillness. For the first time in months, the fog broke. Not faded, not lifted, but broke, as though it had been a solid thing cracking apart in the air. A single shaft of sunlight pierced the sky over Norfolk, falling not on farmland nor town square, but directly upon St. Drogo's parish, now more mausoleum than church. The morning bells did not ring. The clock tower did not chime. But at precisely 3:00 a.m., every man, woman, and child within a mile of the parish woke gasping as a sound not made by anything of lungs or tongue pierced their ears, a whistle without pitch or rhythm, a thread of noise too thin to grasp but impossible to ignore, the kind of sound that felt like it came from inside the skull, sliding behind the eyes and reverberating through the marrow. Infants cried without tears. Dogs clawed at walls until their nails tore. And somewhere in the fields, just beyond the edge of town, crows fell dead in a perfect circle. Beaks pointed toward the parish as if in final homage. Those brave or foolish enough to approach St. Drogo's at dawn saw only this. The great wooden doors of the church slowly, silently, swinging inward, without visible hands, without wind, as though the building had inhaled and opened itself. No one entered. No one dared. But from within, voices rose. Not the frantic cacophony of terror or praise, but the now familiar harmony of the 44 altar boys. No longer children in the eyes of the town, but vessels of something so ancient and enduring that even God himself, some whispered, had forgotten it. The mass that followed was not seen by anyone but heard by all. Though no congregants were allowed, or perhaps welcomed, inside, the sounds escaped the building with perfect clarity. The chanting no longer resembled a forgotten tongue. It had become something else entirely, a blend of every dead language stitched together into a single living form, a song composed of extinct syllables and rituals that echoed across time like a stone dropped into the still water of human memory. The voices did not layer, They wove, turning the air into a tapestry of resonance. Windows quivered. Earth hummed. People fell to their knees in their homes, unaware of why their hearts raced or why the air smelled faintly of ash and salt. It was as if the entire town had become a vessel for something being birthed or remembered. At the center of it all stood Father Anselm, his body little more than a silhouette behind the stained glass, arms raised not in blessing but in surrender. His robes clung to a frame now so thin he seemed carved from candle wax left too long in the sun. Witnesses claimed the crucifix behind him had twisted during the Mass, its wooden Christ arching backward, mouth open in something between scream and song. Inside, the boys did not move individually. They turned, knelt, and sang in perfect unison. Not like a choir, but like the gears of a great hidden machine that had only now resumed its grinding work. As the sun reached the horizon, rising blood-red through the thinning mist, the church let out a sound that no one who heard it ever described the same way. Some said it was a thunderclap, others a scream from beneath the ground, and still others described it as a long exhale, like something vast had just been released. Then, all at once, the stained glass windows shattered outward, not inward, as though whatever had been inside no longer needed to be contained. The fragments scattered across the yard, catching the dawn light like rubies. But these were no ordinary shards. Each one bore inscriptions etched into the glain. Letters no scholar could recognize, symbols that flickered at the edge of vision, never the same when viewed twice. The doors of St. Drogo's slammed shut with a force that shook the earth. One man standing half a block away claimed to see flames ripple across the stone facade, though nothing ever burned. Another swore he saw the entire church inhale once more, then hold its breath. When the first parishioner dared approach that evening to clean the grounds, they found the doors sealed. Not locked, but fused, as though welded by a heat not of fire, but of force. The hinges were gone. The frame melded into the stone like bone grown over a wound. No tools could pry it open. No keys, no prayers. And from that day forward, the interior of St. Drogo's would never be seen again. The building became a monument to whatever had happened within, though no plaque marked the event, and no memorial was ever held. There was no need. Everyone remembered. They remembered in silence. They remembered in nightmares. And they remembered because the silence left behind was not peace, it was waiting. Father Anselm was found 3 weeks later in the bell tower, slumped in a posture of broken reverence. His body was intact, but his eyes were gone. Not torn, not injured, just gone, as though they had never existed in the first place. Clutched in his bony hands was a scroll of thick, crumbling parchment, sealed with wax that smelled faintly of myrrh and copper. No one could open it. Every attempt, no matter how delicate or forceful, caused the scroll to hiss, then tighten like a muscle. A specialist from Cambridge claimed it pulsed when touched. Eventually, it was locked away in the diocese archives. It has not been opened since. Of the boys, no trace remained. The choir loft was empty. Their beds untouched. Only the pews bore evidence. 44 robes, folded neatly, placed side by side in the front row. Each robe bore a single burned symbol on the back, not embroidered, not drawn, but burned into the cloth with surgical precision. The symbols were varied, some Phoenician, some Akkadian, some Elamite, and one that no language expert dared even categorize. One linguist, upon seeing it, tore out his own eyes with a letter opener. Another retired to a monastery and refused to speak again. What they saw, they never explained. St. Drogo's was condemned by royal order within the month. It could not be raised. No fire caught. No wrecking tools held. Those who tried fell ill with fevers that caused them to speak in sleep of deserts they had never walked and tombs they had never entered. Eventually, the land was purchased by a private collector, a man whose name has been lost to history, but who built a mausoleum of black stone over the altar. The structure bears no door, no inscription. It simply exists, like a period placed at the end of a sentence no one ever finished reading. And so it remains. But time, even time heavy with silence, does not forget. Every year, on May 7th, without fail, villagers near the ruins report strange dreams. These are not the dreams of imagination, but shared visions, identical from house to house, old to young. In them the fog returns. It rolls like smoke from a burning library, thick and smelling of salt and old paper. And in the fields beyond the churchyard, 44 boys in white robes stand facing outward, eyes wide, lips parted. They do not move. They do not breathe. They speak in unison, not in Latin, nor in Greek, nor any language known or even suspected. It is a tongue that bends the dream around it. Those who hear it wake screaming, or unable to speak for hours. One woman was found standing in her yard at dawn, arms raised like wings, humming the final lines of the chant before she collapsed, and never rose again. The words, when spoken aloud, cause glass to crack and radios to buzz. And always, in the final moments of the dream, the boys tilt their heads and stare into the dreamer's soul with perfect, infinite recognition, and speak the same phrase, as if offering an accusation, a prophecy, or perhaps a warning that has not yet finished becoming true. We remember your silence. Now, remember ours.